Good morning, everyone. We're here at COP26 in Glasgow, Scotland, where negotiators from around the world are trying to address our climate emergency. We are clearly on a trend to increase global warming beyond limits that are tolerable, not only for human existence, but for our planetary ecosystems. We've seen in these last few days, negotiators talking about the different pollutants that are causing climate change. The science is clear. We are on a trend that we must reverse. And one pollutant especially has come up as a last-minute savior, which is methane, 84 times worse than CO2, and one of these so-called short-lived climate pollutants. We're discussing a methane pledge here at COP, and the idea would be to try to keep methane reductions under control and actually reduce them 30% by 2030. Over 100 countries have signed the Methane Pledge, and this gives us a chance, an opportunity to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Why is 1.5 degrees Celsius important? It's what the scientists say is the threshold, it's the limit. Beyond that, we get into very serious, irreversible climate change. We have with us today Tero from Snowchange in Finland. Tero works as a fisherman, but he also works very closely with indigenous communities in a part of the world that is heating much faster than the rest. Many times, the amount of global warming that the rest of the world is feeling, the Arctic region is feeling it much worse. We are seeing melting sea ice, melting glaciers, and also perhaps a much more dangerous part of global warming, melting permafrost. This is frozen ground that contains ice, that is frozen and has been frozen for hundreds and even many thousands of years. Melting permafrost is of great concern because in this permafrost is organic material, organic matter that has been frozen for many, many centuries or thousands of years. And as it melts, it releases methane gas. So Tero, welcome to our panel. The idea today is to talk a bit about what you do in the Arctic, what you're witnessing, what you're feeling, and what the communities of the Arctic are experiencing with climate change. I think you've seen it long before we have in the rest of the world. Tell us a little bit about what's going on in this part of the planet.
Well, Daniel, thank you. And all the people there and in the audience, let me greet you from the Boreal Finland, where we just had our first snow that actually stayed on for the night. So it's that moment in time in the past when the winter would have started and we could count for a reliable cryosphere winter. Of course, as you outlined, the difficulty today in the north, in the Boreal and Arctic, is that every new winter is the new one. Lots of melt events, lots of unpredictable changes, and also correctly you identified that our region is indeed warming up faster than any other place in the world. And the difficulty with this region is that the consequences of warming here don't stay here. And out of those changes that are underway in the Arctic, methane bursts from the soil and the seafloor are some of the most relevant ones as feedback phenomena and actual phenomena that increases the atmospheric pollution fast. I'm looking forward to a conversation. I'll just maybe point out a couple of main things that are going on. One of the things has to do with, as you said, permanently frozen areas on terrestrial ecosystems, those lands that have been frozen for millennia, and they are now thawing. The organization that I work for is called Snowchange, of course, a bit for a reason. We are 21 years old, and as you pointed out, the early warnings of melting permafrost events were first registered in Arctic Canada, for example, by the Inuit hunters in 2000. They were actually discussed in a COP in 2000 back in the day. And then in Siberia, where a lot of our operational activities are. I have witnessed myself whole slumps of coastal kilometer after kilometer of the East Siberian Sea dumping into the sea and slumping because it's now warming in the summertime. You can see also pretty dramatic outlook of whole lakes disappearing when the permafrost surrounding wall has erupted, and literally within hours you can have the dispersal of the water away and still fish struggling for their life in a place where used to be a lake. Or thirdly, of course, we know of the landscape shifts where when the thaw happens, the whole landscape can drop even a meter in a year in some parts of the north. And all of these have, of course, tremendous consequences for the member communities and partners that Snowchange works with. These are the indigenous peoples and local communities in the Arctic. I'm not going to go now into a long list, but I'll just point out some of the facts that what many people don't realize is that the permafrost melt, the methane bursts are an actual daily event, and the impacts are to do with reindeer herding, fisheries, food security, and some of the most remote indigenous communities in the world. So people have to think, how will they survive in a new landscape? How can they deal with a lake that disappeared in front of their eyes when they used to be fishing? How can they change their nomadic reindeer routes with the animals if the soils have become now completely different? These are some of the complexities combined, of course, with the big fires that are affecting the permafrost melt and subsequent methane releases. And maybe the last thing I'll end with now is the diseases. So already in 2016, we saw anthrax being released from some of the permafrost meltings campsites, and it killed a young boy. So let me dedicate this talk now to his memory, that there are already completely new victims in the Arctic because of the permafrost thaw and the waiting diseases like smallpox and anthrax that have been frozen on those lands, in addition to the methane trouble. So those are some of the things that we are observing, and I'm happy also to outline some of the solutions a little bit later. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Tero. This is exactly where I wanted to take our conversation. I have on the binder that I brought to me to COP, I have a picture, which you may recognize. This is from a lake in the boreal region. And what we're looking at are frozen bubbles of methane under the lake. And we have seen individuals pop open a hole in the lake and light a match to it, and you get a big explosion. This is happening all over the northern parts of our planet. And as you say, this is affecting the way of life of a lot of people. I've heard some people say it's great that the planet is warming in places like the Arctic because it's not so cold anymore. And you hear that now ship channels through the Arctic Ocean are being opened up. But this, of course, presents a lot of challenges to the local ecosystems. And if you could talk a little bit about some of those changes and how indigenous communities are having to face these changes, not only of the deteriorating ecosystem, but now of the intrusion of industrial projects like oil and gas exploration or shipping. How is this affecting the area, and what do you foresee as climate continues to change if we don't stop global warming and the acceleration that we're seeing in recent years?
Thanks, Daniel. Well, one of the things to always keep in mind when we discuss the North is that while it's often the target of many people's thoughts, organizations, governments, multinational corporations, we have to remember that it's a homeland of over 40 distinct indigenous peoples and many other cultures. There are 8 countries, but as I said, there are over 40 different indigenous peoples and 70 different linguistic entities. So the Arctic and the North comes in many different forms. The other thing to keep in mind is that while the big narrative on the Arctic melt, of course, is partly true and it's highly relevant for the global audiences and the world itself, there are a lot of solutions that are also here, made from the North for the North, and I can outline some of them in a bit, but let me try to answer quickly your points. One of the things to do with the North and the Arctic is that while the climate impact is pretty severe here, much like what we heard from Tuvalu and the minister on his ocean delivery a couple of days ago, this is also an area of untapped mineral, oil and gas, and timber wealth, and also freshwater and some of the other assets that are still in many parts of the Arctic, even though there are mines, there are oil and gas fields and so on. In scale, we are looking at the big bonanza of the world. This is the place where a lot of the untapped wealth for the whole planet still resides. And there are some parts of the Arctic where indigenous rights to the land and waters have been solved, but in some parts, like in Finland, for example, those rights have not been realized. And this creates a legal imbalance and a conflict for big plans to harvest the Arctic resources or even conservation and unrealized indigenous rights. So that's kind of a underlying theme for some of the parts of the North that has not really been solved. How do indigenous peoples then navigate is, of course, something that we have to wake ourselves up and think that these are not victims. They are also active agents of change. And one of the things that the Arctic peoples have always tried to do is to adapt to the kind of changing ecosystems over the past 10,000 years in the region. The difficulty for this transition and orderly adaptation and participation in these big things has to do with the fact that so much of our and indigenous peoples, I'm a Finnish person, and then of course Snowchange has these indigenous communities as members, they are so dependent on the snow and ice, the cryosphere, for our linguistic, cultural, and food security survival. And now that if that's taken away, that will have quite many cascading impacts on not only the day-to-day, but also the people's mind, cultural side, and survival. One of the difficulties, and maybe I'll stop here, is the fact that we are witnessing a lot of southern species that are moving now into the north. Why would I raise that? Biodiversity issue has to do with the fact that over the past millennia, a lot of the species, the seals, the whales, the polar bear, the insects, the pollinators, the birds, and so on, they have adapted, okay? So they have come up with a way of endemic solutions to a lot of the cold-based ecosystems. And they are highly fragile. The Arctic fox can't live in Sudan. It can't live in Berlin. It has to live in the cold ecosystems where it has come to exist. And now what we are witnessing with the species on the move from the south is that we are getting damages and local extinction events of the Arctic fauna and flora and replacing them with the generalist species. One good example is cod. So the Atlantic cod is moving very fast and aggressively on the Atlantic ecosystems further north. And all of these will then again have consequences for a lot of... So the one-line sentence would be that the Arctic is now a very dynamic region with a lot of interests for extractives, natural resources. It's partly in a limbo regarding rights and survival of indigenous peoples. And it's thirdly hit heavily by climate change, also in the biodiversity side, with the southern and more temperate species moving north, changing the structure and functionality of a lot of the ecosystems.
Tero, thank you for a master class in Arctic ecosystems. It's very appreciated. One thing that I'd like to touch is participation and engagement in solutions. And you just mentioned the importance of indigenous communities as patrons and sort of stewards of their own resources and solutions. We're having a discussion here at COP about reducing methane. And for example, when we are talking about methane reduction in agriculture, we talk about farmers needing to think about reducing emissions. But many farmers suggest that the climate agenda is not bringing them into the discussion about the solutions to their own practices. And it's more about controlling them rather than integrating them. I see some parallel problems perhaps with the indigenous communities that are in the Arctic. Much of the world is concerned about the Arctic, but not necessarily integrating indigenous opinion and engagement into these solutions. Where do you see the opportunities for negotiators? And because we are here with negotiators, what do we tell them about how to integrate Indigenous communities in the decisions and in the proposal for solutions, to work collaboratively and to not have this be an agenda that is imposed on a community that is already suffering in many, many ways the impacts of climate change?
Yeah, Daniel, those are very good points and links to what you are really outlining is a conversation on power and how power has manifested in the talks and also through the historical space on solutions. And what comes to mind is that many of the indigenous peoples are, especially the ones in the region and local communities, always, hopefully this will continue to be the norm, are always willing, often to be the participants and sharing their knowledges and solution space to whoever wants to listen. I guess the complexity of climate change and the Arctic has to do with the fact that many of the indigenous groups have outlined the fact that we can't understand the present without understanding the past grievances that happened. The equity, the colonial process that overtook the Arctic and the Arctic resources, starting from the whales. Already 500 years ago, there was a massive harvest of commercial whaling, all the way to the oil and gas and mining that's currently underway. So some of the logic of trying to engage with the indigenous peoples as solutions in the Arctic comes from the realization that, on rather simple terms, what can we do to demarcate indigenous homelands and critically important ecosystems away from harm's way? So following the logic of if it's still there and functions, for example, as a carbon sink, what can we do to safeguard the functionality of that? The second one has to do with memory. A lot of the indigenous peoples, let alone indigenous Australians who can date back 44,000 years of ecosystem change, possess the kind of memory of baseline ecosystem shifts and understanding of their homelands that would be extremely valuable, combined, of course, with indigenous knowledge, wisdom, and ethics. But these are important, shall we say, contextual processes that we could try to advance. But they don't come in hand in the day-to-day crisis of what is really underway on the methane, for example, right now. What I was outlining is more on the participation and engagement side. On the practical side, I could give you a shopping list of 10 things to do, what we know of. I'll just give you 3 for the lack of time. For example, there are urgent things that we could try to do on flaring, trying to reduce the methane and other pollution events from operations that are to do with oil and gas. That creates soot. It's a black pollution that comes from flaring on oil and gas fields, and it will tarnish the snow, collecting more and more sunlight and speeding up again the melt events when the sunlight starts to burn in the spring and summer. Secondly, I think we could increase so much better the observation of change. While we have remote sensing and all these fancy birds in the sky, I think there is a lot of, shall we say, benefits from engaging with indigenous land-based observations. For example, it was actually the reindeer herders who detected the very first methane craters in Siberia, not science, back in 2014. So the observational capacity and responding, for example, to forest fires, tundra fires, could be increased significantly. The last thing that I'll outline very quickly is that, and this is a complex one, so many local communities would like to start on a road called rewilding, restoration of ecosystems, restarting carbon sinks and traps that have been degraded by man-made land use. The difficulty with that is that we can't do much on the permafrost melt soils. There will continue to be a methane outbursts and an influx from these lands. But there are other large ecosystems in the north, like the peatlands, that could be restored in scale and fast to buy time on water quality, keeping 24 Celsius degrees of water temperature that would enable survival for a lot of culturally significant salmonid species. And ultimately, this becomes almost like a equity and self-enabling mechanism if you rewild and protect, of course, those ecosystems that are relevant to the communities. So it's really a combination of a toolbox that includes carving space, increasing observation, and also taking action like rewilding, because 1/3 of world's soil-based carbon is still in the northern peatlands and forests.
Tero, this has been a fascinating discussion. I think we need you to be here to talk to the negotiators and relay your story. I mean, it's so rich in information and knowledge. And I hope that as we try to find solutions to climate change, we really integrate the view of the most affected communities, of those that are on the front line, of people like you and your colleagues and other Indigenous leaders and communities in the Arctic regions. We see this happening all over the world, and some of the solutions you're proposing are very much applicable to other ecosystems. But certainly we have an emergency going on right now, as you suggest, the burning of forests and the emissions from flaring and other oil and gas operations, generating soot to darken glaciers. I mean, these are really at the heart of the problems that you're seeing in the Arctic. Thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you for joining our discussion on climate equity at COP. We wish you the best and hope that in the few years to come, this methane moment that we are living will put in motion activities and actions and plans and really the work on the ground that is needed to change our predicament, to avoid these climate tipping points, and to begin to address this climate emergency that we're facing. Thank you, Tero. I don't know if you have any last words to share with us before we turn it over to the next panel, but thank you very much again for being with us. Tero, last word for you.
Daniel and all the organizers, thank you for this and allowing the voice of the Snowchange communities to be heard in COP. We don't take this for granted. And as I have said in the past, we need almost like a Marshall Plan for the Arctic, by the Arctic. So join us in a historic mission to do that. Thank you for this, and I wish you all the best there.